My podcast guest this week isn't necessarily a household name here in the UK, but in American intellectual and conservative circles he's a seriously big noise. He's been a writer and editor for some of the US's most prestigious publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. He's just launched a magazine, and we'll talk about that forthwith. His writing, if you've come across it, is characterized by that ability, that rare ability to get straight to the heart of a problem. He writes with great flair, and a flair that's underpinned not least by his staunch Roman Catholic faith. He is Sohrab Ahmari, who joins me now. Sohrab, thanks so much for joining me on the Colin Brazier Podcast. We appreciate your time, not least given that you've had a fairly late night, I understand, launching Compact, the journal. What is it?
So Compact Magazine is a new journal on web-based, compactmag.com, that seeks to challenge what we see as a failed and corrupt Western overclass. These are the people who plunged the West into 20 years of stupid and bloody wars. These are the people who used COVID, we think, to enrich corporations like Amazon while leaving a wide swath of destruction across the landscape of small business. And again, this is both in Europe and the United States. And these are the people who gave up our manufacturing base, again, both in Europe and the United States, especially in the United States, to industrialize China, which has done certainly well for China, but it's not been so good for American workers. So we want to challenge them. And then we are, like GBNews, we're independent, which means we're only accountable to our readers. Our first 12 pieces are up. As I look at them now, there's a heavy tilt right now about opposing escalation in Ukraine. We describe ourselves as a radical American journal. And by radical, we don't mean extreme. In fact, we would argue that the elite consensus is extreme and deeply out of touch with what ordinary people aspire to. But we do take the word radical seriously in the sense of going to the root of things. And we think that being radical right now means questioning at least the drumbeats of war and the march to war.
Sorry, as somebody in your case who used to edit an op-ed page, you're used to parsing what are those threads of what's going through the news agenda daily, weekly, and deciding what you really need to focus on. So my question is about your selection of your first choice for Compact, because it's difficult. You've had time to think about it, and beyond writing a piece that says, here we are, this is what we stand for. If you had to write one piece at the moment based on one idea for the launch edition of a magazine, what was that burning question you had to address? Well,
in some ideal world, I would write about very philosophical questions, but we're running a news company, a media company at the end of the day. And so I did write an opening piece for Compact, and I explored how it feels like it's 2003 again with some of and look, I supported those earlier wars, but have kind of come clean about it and regret it. But that sense that it's, we've got to escalate, and if you don't like it, then you must be a Putin stooge or a Kremlin stoolie and enjoy your freedom fries. How is that happening? And how is it possible, again, that the same personnel in some cases who made those now, in retrospect, obviously catastrophic decisions, didn't pay any price? They're back in action and driving us down the same path.
It's funny you should mention 2003. I'm just going to walk down my own memory lane briefly, if you'll indulge me. It was my daughter's birthday, my second eldest daughter's birthday, Agnes, on the 19th of March. I remember it's a particularly memorable birthday for me because it also coincides with the invasion of Iraq, and I was embedded at the time with the US 3rd Infantry Division, and they were the first people across the border into Iraq, and the first US troops, the first Allied troops to get to Baghdad. In fact, I didn't see a picture of Agnes until I received it on a laptop at Baghdad International Airport some weeks after. I mention this because on the road to Baghdad, there was this famous thunder run where we made time really quickly to get to Baghdad. And there was a moment when we were told that maybe we'd found the Holy Grail, we'd found the weapons of mass destruction, we'd found the WMD. There'd been a cache of arms that were found. It was exotic materiel, and it was sent off. And I was there. I was embedded with Sky, but there was also CBS and AP. And in those hours that they were gone, these soldiers, we thought, well, this is it. The whole casus belli for this war is about to be proven. They've found WMD. They came back and said, guys, you know what? It wasn't that exotic. It certainly wasn't WMD. And I've said to people since, as our conservative movement that we both subscribe to has at times grown more hysterical and inclined to believing absurd conspiracy theories, that would have been the easiest conspiracy theory in the world to hatch, wouldn't it? We found them, guys. And there we were, mainstream media, embedded with the army, simplest thing to pull off. So look, I'm digressing and self-indulging a little bit, Sohrab, but you know what I'm trying to get to, that was demonstrably, factually a dismissal of any conspiracy theory. And yet many of our fellow travellers seem so inclined to believe that BS.
Yes, and equally the notion that, for example, there were deep operating ties between Saddam Hussein and the people behind 9/11. I mean, there was an entire book published here by Steve Hayes, who now is still like a neoconservative grandee. That was like old school fake news. It was fake news before we had the term fake news. And like the example you mentioned, it just doesn't. No one pays a price. It's a very strange world.
Let's talk about paying a price. Let's talk about moral hazard. One of the things, and I'm sorry to jump around a little bit here, but I think moral hazard has been something I've been conjuring with recently because, the last 2 years, like many TV journalists, I've been absorbed by COVID. And there's a question I can't answer. Maybe you can help me. Do modelers face some moral hazard? If modelers get it so wrong, if modelers say, the epidemiologists say, COVID's going to be this bad and you must take this action, and that action accidentally results in huge mental health problems, massive oncological backlogs, people dying needlessly of cancer. Where can there be moral hazard for modelers?
I assume you're alluding to Dr. Ferguson and his predictions of absolute doom and gloom, which, as you say, became the basis of very drastic lockdown policies. Since then, obviously, there's been revisions of that model, or revisions of his reception, whether or not it was actually correct or not, and to what degree it was incorrect. No, I mean there really hasn't been. It's funny to me that Ferguson's person is very interesting in the sense that it was this felt collective need for accountability for him, and it was found not by addressing head on, the premises of his models, or whether or not these models are actually, whether there should be questioning how basing social policy on just these sort of the epidemiological models. That's not how he was got. It was because he was breaking COVID rules, like seeing his mistress or whatever. I can't remember what it was, but it was this sort of a small lapse. I was like, aha. And to me, I mean, that was a tabloid way of getting at someone who is, again, there's this need to hold them accountable, but we have to do it through this way. In the United States, we had a similar example. We had Andrew Cuomo in the state that I live in. The governor of New York State was, in the early days of the pandemic, he was doing these very commanding press conferences, and he became the face of calm and assured action, which was contrasted by the media by President Trump's, admittedly, that's his style, very seemingly haphazard response to the pandemic. But as it happens, Cuomo had made a terrible decision, which was to insist that nursing homes accept COVID positive patients, which caused somewhere around deaths of 15,000 people. There was a real genocide of old people in New York nursing homes. And so then his reception shifted. Couldn't get him for that decision, but he was Me Too'd. And so the people find a way to, but it's weird. We can't, not that the Me Too cases weren't important, but I will say that they were not the most egregious. This was not Jeffrey Epstein level Me Too. He's Italian, so he likes to sort of squeeze people's cheeks and so forth. But what's outrageous about that, as you say, is ultimately that his real lapse in leadership wasn't addressed. He was got for something else.
And look, at the end of the day, just because an epidemiologist says, "Look, Minister, this is the data, these are the models, these are the projections I'm showing you," it's up to our elected officials to say, actually, okay, I accept them, and then we're going to take these steps as a consequence. I mean, of course, they're hardly going to repudiate that advice, are they? Because if they do and it goes wrong and the modellers turn out to be right, then come the public inquiry, it's resignation time. I think my point is, do we trust the academy, the scientific academy, to say to the modellers, you really cocked up, guys, and there's got to be a price to be paid, at least maybe in terms of your career. I don't know. I hate the idea of clamping down on the free expression of ideas and academics doing what they do best. But when there is such a massive cost to getting it wrong, then maybe there just needs to be a mechanism by which we do something about that.
I want to pick up on something you said a little bit earlier, and I think that's really the right point, is that the real accountability for a political decision has to lie with the statesman or stateswoman. And this was the problem. It's not, you're right. It wasn't the problem that people put forward various models. It was that the statesmen and women, our political leaders, substituted graphs for ultimately a kind of wider prudential judgment. Which is what they have to do. Politics is the art of deciding what is prudent given a certain circumstance. And yes, you should take into account the voice of public health officials and epidemiologists, but also you should take into account the voice of mental health experts and alcohol abuse experts and loneliness experts, and the question of the economy and the question of the well-being of workers and labor union and so on and so forth. And collectively putting all that together, the statesman or woman, the politician, should make the decision. Not just this sort of, it's precisely scientism as opposed to science that we're dealing with when we say that scientific questions are the only ones worth considering or asking, and at the expense of a whole range of other questions that don't have scientific answers. They're moral questions, they're political questions. And when the epidemiologists themselves feed this mistake by saying there is such a thing as the science with a capital S, and if a politician takes a different view or makes a different decision, he or she is violating the science. And so that's, I think, ultimately where real accountability has to lie, is with the political leader not to become sort of narrow about what source of information to pay attention to, but sort of take a broad view. That's just politics.
When we think about scientism, we think about it as this all-consuming, suffocating belief system that squeezes out other ways of looking at the human condition, most obviously religion chief amongst them. I want to get into the role of faith in public life, and I want to start by saying this. A friend of mine pointed out yesterday to me a part of a press conference that we at GBNews, but other news channels, took in full for a couple of hours. And it was a great story. It was the release of an Anglo-Iranian woman called Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who'd been held by the Iranians for 6 years. And in the press conference, a long press conference, at one point she said, she was asked, about the being incarcerated for that long, how it had changed her, and she said, well, it really deepened my faith. And then the journalists moved straight on, and none of the other journalists picked up the point. And it was absolutely fascinating. I wanted more on that. I mean, I've no idea what her faith is, even less now how it was deepened. And it just reminded me of how my tribe, mainstream media tribe, is so uncomfortable asking that question. And the funny thing was, I know privately the journalist who was involved in putting the question, but this person I know to be a devout Roman Catholic. And yet they couldn't bring themselves to ask a question about how her faith deepened. How did we get there?
I really don't. I really don't know. I think I do know that, but it's a sort of I worry it's a dull answer. But we've had a process of profound secularization in the West. It's not a matter of decades, but of centuries, such that faith has been reduced to a private matter without public implications, such that when someone like a public figure, in this case, a former prisoner, brings up faith, okay, that's your private thing, set it aside, and that doesn't have important public implications. So let's ask about the serious public things. And it's unfortunate. A lot of the world is still religious. A lot of the world is still bound to God in one way or another. And so if journalists don't have a language or a curiosity, including, I mean, in this case, it's sad to say that it's the journalist himself or herself, person of faith, then our media lose sight of this sort of pivotal dimension of what it means to be human. But that's it's not. Let me revise. It's not even just secularization. It's privatization of faith. The idea that faith is only sort of, there are these public things that we discuss that are matters of public reason, and then there is faith, which is your private understanding. Pope Benedict, you'll remember this, had a wonderful statement on this issue at Regensburg in 2006, the Regensburg Address, which was misunderstood by much of the mainstream media.
This is when he talked about the old Byzantine emperor. Is it that one?
Yes, exactly. And his encounter with a Muslim scholar. But people misunderstood that in the press as a harangue against Islam, which it wasn't. It was a harangue against the West, saying your account of what's reason and reasonable has become so narrow since the Enlightenment that it excludes lots of questions that matter to people, which they find answers to in religion and philosophy, answers that aren't readily translatable into scientific kind of formulations, but which are nevertheless vital and true. That was the point of the Regensburg Address, of course, in part because of the illiteracy, the religious illiteracy of so much of the media. It was incorrectly framed and caused obviously an explosion in the Muslim world. But I think it's privatization and a very narrow account of what really is reasonable.
And the part of that privatization and that religious illiteracy, I mean, where to begin on religious illiteracy? I mean, one thing that strikes me when I, watch TV with the kids, there's very often, if you're watching period drama, for instance, there's this determination to offer as much verisimilitude as possible. We'll get the clothes exactly as they were in Edwardian times. We'll get the building just as it was in the Georgian era. But then the way people speak is often, modernized. I sort of get that. But then the complete expunging of how important faith, Christianity, would have been at that time, how it set the punctuation marks for the day, the week, the year, completely obliterated. And it's this act of posthumous historical self-harm, it seems to me.
Yes, I mean, projecting on of the present onto the past. There are exceptions, though. There's a wonderful HBO show, I don't know if you watch, called The Young Pope.
Yes, with the British actor Jude Law.
With Jude Law as a kind of traditionalist American pope. But what's interesting is so astute about that show is it gets into various dynamics within Catholicism that you're surprised someone in the world of Hollywood and HBO is that clever. But that, you're absolutely right, is the exception rather than the norm.
Yeah, quite surreal actually that program at times, wasn't it? I enjoyed it a lot. If it comes down to making a choice, you're going to have to give something away about yourself, Sohrab, here, between the two popes, as presented in the Netflix, I think it was, film, where we're looking at a sort of Pope Francis type and a Pope Benedict time, conservative versus, in quotes, liberal. How do you fall? Which camp do you fall into, or is my analysis, my question, simply too crude?
It's a perfectly fair question. I just see a lot more continuity between the popes, despite there are absolutely differences in shift and tone and emphasis. And there are some, for example, questions of liturgical questions where there's real differences. And I happen to be on the Benedict side because Pope Benedict restored some of the older liturgy of the church that had been lost as a result of a misunderstanding of what the Second Vatican Council was supposed to have wrought. And Pope Francis obviously is not a fan of the more traditional liturgy. It's very obvious. So on that, I would argue on that question, I'm definitely a Pope Benedict person. But more broadly, on many other issues, I I just see more continuity than people in the media do. And to give you an example, which ties it together to our other discussion, I was lucky. I was part of it when I was working at the Post. I was part of a journalists group that followed Pope Francis when he traveled to Abu Dhabi and became the first Roman pontiff to set foot on the Arabian Peninsula. And in his statements, sitting next to Muslim scholars, especially the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, which is the most important Sunni Muslim sort of school of seminary, school of theology, Pope Benedict was making the same kinds of critiques of a narrow Enlightenment reason as had his predecessor, Pope Benedict. So Francis was in fact, the documents, often Vatican documents have these footnotes. And if you look at the footnotes of the Francis speeches in Abu Dhabi, they cited back to Pope Benedict. Benedict's writing. So just is one example of how there's this sort of deeper continuity. And in fact, if there weren't continuity in the Catholic Church, if it was just like kind of presidential elections, when the next team comes, things radically change, it would not be the Catholic faith. It would be deeply unsettling. It's precisely that sort of iron continuity that, for people like me, I'm a convert now, I can disclose that, makes the church such a consolation that there's one thing in the world that's stable, continuous.
I agree completely with that. I'll come back on to the conversion story because it's interesting. But just I said to a colleague yesterday, and not entirely flippantly, wouldn't it be great if Pope Francis got into the Pope Mobile or got on, and went to Lviv and went to Ukraine and said, I bring the offer of, I bring the hope, the message of peace and reconciliation, stop bombing. I mean, look, pipe dream stuff, but it just feels that within this crisis, the only figure globally who could actually make a sort of coup de theatre like that is Francis. It's not going to happen, but we can imagine.
I think that there were some extraordinary gestures early on. Pope Francis took his own vehicle, as you'll remember, and went to the Russian embassy to the Holy See. We don't know what was said. And I will say this is very interesting. At least there's been reporting in the European Catholic press, including La Croix, which is a French Catholic magazine, that Holy See diplomats are against just mindlessly flooding Ukraine with arms because they believe that will just extend the conflict without actually altering the ultimate outcome, because Russia is a stronger state. So under Catholic just war theory, you can't wage a war if in fact there isn't a reasonable chance of winning, if you're just fighting and you're extending misery. But yeah, I mean, that sort of diplomacy that you're talking about, I would love to see that too. It's part. We know Pope Francis has a nerve issue. I forget what the sort of diagnosis is, but it's very painful. He's quite enfeebled, which is some irony there, because his predecessor is still alive, Pope Benedict, very old but still alive, and that brings the church into weird situations of two popes, or one emeritus and one current pope, both of them fairly ailing. But
so, as you say, at the end of the day, it's just diplomacy. And Joseph Stalin, wasn't it, who said, who asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? So it can only ever just be words, obviously. Conversion. I spent 2 decades at a mainstream broadcaster here in the UK, and towards the end, I grew really very disaffected, but privately disaffected with the direction of travel. And one of my sort of guerrilla activities was that I would identify people who spoke to me, who I thought were sort of intellectual heroes, and just ring them up, email them, come for lunch. Let me just remind you that there are people out there in the mainstream media who are rooting for you, even though we can never obviously show that. I mean, people like Douglas Murray, and I'd take him for lunch, and what struck me with people like him, others too, very often was that, eventually I took the leap and quit my job. But these people actually faced genuine tests of their moral and even physical courage. I mean, I won't go into details, but, Douglas has faced many death threats over the years. And I imagine that applies to you too. If you are what could be characterised as an apostate, who has left his Shia faith, as I read that you did, and to embrace Christianity, that's going to bring down opprobrium on your head, and not just commentary, but actual threats of physical violence. And I salute people who have that bravery. That's what it is.
Well, honestly, I have to say, in my case, I can't take credit for that kind of bravery, because I came from a very secular family in Iran. I was born among kind of secular intellectual types, upper middle class in Iran, such that when I was received in the church, essentially in my own immediate family, there was either indifference or cheers. Yeah. And I was received at a London church, actually, because I was living in Britain for 4 years. And that's when I ultimately kind of made the ultimate decision to say, okay, I'm going to become a Catholic. And I wasn't planning on announcing it, I should say. Certainly at least not until after I was baptized and received into the church. But then Father Hamel was killed by a pair of jihadists. He's a French priest in Normandy, pair of jihadists inspired by Islamic State. That was when I said, okay, I have to do something. I'm about to become Catholic. How do I react to this? So like any millennial, I took to Twitter and tweeted out, I am Father Hamel, hashtag je suis Hamel, Père Hamel. And everyone thought I had, because they looked up, I have a public profile, I had a Wikipedia page about me. They looked at that and said, oh, this person must be a Muslim. Look at him, he's from Iran. And that kind of story set in. Muslim converts because of this brutal act. It wasn't true. It was made for a very good story. So then I had to write a memoir to explain that, in fact, that's not how I'd come to the faith. But the one side detail in this and all this is that because we were in London, the priest who was instructing me said, could you take down that tweet because you mentioned the church and there's a lot of crazies in London. I was like, right. Sorry, Father. Not wise as a serpent.
That's nuts, isn't it? But there we are. As you say, you came from a broadly secular Iranian family. The Iran that we've all seen sort of the black and white pictures of when the Shah was still in place, pre-Iranian Revolution '79. It's almost inconceivable that Iran ever existed now. Were your family rooted in that culture, in that life, in that world?
Well, it still does. It's just behind closed doors now. And this is one of the troubles or crises of Iranian life ever since. I was born after the revolution, but it was a kind of permanent fact of my life in the milieu in which I had grown up, was the fact that we all lived in two worlds. There was the world behind closed doors, in which alcohol flowed freely and Western ideas and books and movies and so forth were discussed. And then there was the world outside, which was, especially then, less so now, I would say. They've chilled out a little bit. But at the time, it was immediate post-revolutionary years, a society that had re-Islamized itself quite self-consciously. And to live in that double world was a kind of very Iranian experience. And I will say, over time, which is a very disturbing fact as an immigrant to the West, is that I now see something like that happening in the West with more muted form. There's no judicial floggings and so forth, but there are things that people will say behind closed doors that we dare not say in public. And that's a very terrifying thought for someone like me who's escaped to the free society in order not to have to live a kind of double life like that.
Well, I remember traveling in the 90s, early 90s, all the way across Iran to get to Pakistan and through cities like Isfahan and obviously Tehran. And in Tehran in particular, been struck by those huge murals with things like the Star of David and a skull superimposed on it and a mushroom cloud. It was pretty clear what the state felt about things. But as you say, behind all that, and this became clearer as the years rolled by, the internet penetration pretty much higher than anywhere else in that part of the world, but even sort of by global standards. So there was this sort of duality. There were these two dialogues going on in Iran. I'd never made the connection between that and sort of what we're increasingly seeing here. Let me make this connection though, which is how the internet is leading to different types of conversations. Well, that's such a sweeping statement, isn't it? But if you think about what we're doing now and this idea of a 50-minute long chat, people say to me, Colin, look, these things won't fly. A hour-long chat. It's got to be a tweet. No, this discursive, conversational, debate about ideas. It's catching fire again.
I agree, and well, two thoughts about that. One is I'm a little bit worried about the consolidation of internet ownership. Of these big platforms controlled by a very few, which has resulted in crucial cases, including one I was involved in 2020. So now been 2 years now. I was working at the New York Post, and we dug up Hunter Biden's his emails. And it was a solid story. I mean, I was not part of the reporting team. I was on the comment pages. I was running the opinion pages. So, but I defended our paper because I knew that what we had dug up was true. But it was deleted from, you couldn't share it on Twitter, including on private messages. It was reduced in circulation on Facebook, and we were banned from Twitter for 2 weeks. The New York Post, being America's oldest continuously published daily newspaper, it was founded by one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. So the fact that they were able to do that and they did that is very alarming, and has continued with critics about COVID and so forth, finding themselves unpersoned on the internet. So that's one thought, hold that thought. The other thought that I have with respect to this is this flowering of conversation is I am a little bit worried about the loss of print culture. I've made a point of trying to read, magazines and newspapers like one used to do, from beginning to end, so that you have this sort of contextualized sense of what's happening in the world, rather than what can often be very sort of everyone's media diet, including people in the media, have this haphazard, this thing popped up in front of me and some algorithm picked it for me. Now my attention has gone to something else. So I definitely appreciate these long, deep conversations like you and I are having right now, and definitely enabled by the internet. But I also worry about some of the effects of the same amazing technology on general literacy, on news literacy, on print culture.
I make the case to my kids, read a newspaper, guys, because actually there's no better way of triaging efficiently information, because you're holding out a broadsheet and your eye skims so quickly, and it's a much physically bigger space to actually triage that info. And just on the point about illiteracy, literally yesterday, I said to a colleague of mine, nameless colleague, who'd written a script for me and talked about the sad tragedy. And I said, sad tragedy. Are you aware of any happy tragedies? He shook his head. And that kind of, within a newsroom, which obviously the print newsroom, which is, I think, to some degree dying off, that trickle down of pedantry, no, it's tautological, you can't write that. And that idea of words and the precise meaning of words. Orwell reminds us through his description, the glossary about Newspeak in 1984, that idea that the precise definition that you use of a word allows you to see the world more clearly. And, we'll come on to Ukraine, but the number of reports I hear about Ukraine where the town was devastated, she was devastated to have lost, he was devastated. It's a devastating scene. And our ability just to have, precise synonyms to describe loss and pain and anger that now comes in this, I can't speak for American journalism, but in British journalism, everything comes under this catch-all of devastated. It's become this, Sohrab, is it the same? The word devastated, is it so, universal in America? I don't know.
Yes, or a bomb ripped through.
But this is more than journalese. This is more than journalese. It's about it's about a diminishing vocabulary, and it's about an incuriosity about words. Journalese, I think, has always been there.
I will say this though, and obviously I worked for, among others. I mean, I spent most of my career at News Corp, but the latter years at the New York Post, which is very famous for its headlines, or most famously, headless body found in a topless bar, which is this sort of legendary tabloid headline. And the same, I would say, by the way, for The Sun, that at its best, The Sun is actually a school of precise. A Sun leader has to be 200 words, 250 words.
You're so right.
Everything packed with sort of punch. And so again, it's a real loss to lose those old school newsroom guys who would say, we actually don't say it's a sad tragedy. I mean, I'm making a jokey point, but it's true. And sorry, one more funny story about this, which I love, is when you're a young hack, you're asked sometimes to write pieces about these countries that you've never flown over, which is terrifying. There's always a temptation to say, "Oh, Zimbabwe is at a crossroads," which reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson is upgraded to first class, so he gets a free copy of The Economist, and he goes to Marge, "Ooh, Marge, did you know Singapore is at a crossroads?"
Fantastic. Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's talk about how we do the story in such a way that we present another view without necessarily being tarred as a Putin apologist. I know we've talked on air at GBNews about this a couple of times, and we've both identified trends within the coverage of the story which have bothered us and certainly bothers me. One trend that will maybe have indubitably have an effect, which is just fatigue with the story. That if this war carries on, it shows every sign of carrying on, then actually it's a human universal that interest will wane, right?
Oh, I think it's already happened. Someone whom I know is a very kind of serious watcher of digital trends, of what people are searching. And maybe the first week or so, the top searches exploding was Ukraine war. About a week later, then the searches shifted to Ukraine inflation, Ukraine gas prices. So people began to think, how is this affecting? It's like, sorry, I'm like, the tragedy is bad, but I'm worried about what it will mean in terms of energy supply chains being disrupted and so forth. So that's a real phenomenon. People will lose interest. And in some cases, by the way, it's a journalist's job not to allow that to happen, because there are things happening in the world that are moral outrages, and people of conscience still need to pay attention. And that's part of our challenge, is not to allow that to happen.
Yeah, there is a sort of statute of limitations there, isn't there? That it doesn't matter how many. It's like, suddenly I'm back in my English lesson. I'm aged 8, and the tutor's saying, describe the inside of a tennis ball. There are only so many ways of describing the inside of that tennis ball, and it becomes this great test of journalistic ingenuity to find the angle nobody else has thought of, that we haven't done before. But eventually, even that bucket's emptied. And I agree with you. I mean, it becomes part of the vocation of journalism to keep the viewer, the listener, the reader interested when they're no longer interested. I mean, and that's a challenge that that journalists in covering the Ukraine story will face soon, I think. Just in terms of how we a development I think has been palpable has been I think this year is the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War. And the BBC, famously at the time, were much criticised, I imagine not least by leaders in the Sun, for being so impartial, punctiliously impartial. So they would refer to British forces and Argentinian forces, and people would say, "Well, hang on, this is the state broadcaster. This is the British Broadcasting Corporation. These are our guys. These are our boys who have been killed." And now. It's certainly not as scrupulous, and there's a desire to emote, and maybe I'm answering my own question about how journalists find an answer to the question, keep the viewer interested. They bring themselves into the story more.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here in the United States, coverage of the Trump administration had to have this because the narrative frame was Trump is which is funny, both a bumbling idiot, but also a dangerous autocrat. And he could be both, well, it violates the law of contradiction to suggest that he could be both, but they tried. And so how do you constantly have that tone of alarm about Trump, right, and not cover him in a sensible way? Well, a lot of especially our broadcast journalists, had to put themselves into the center of the story of how Trump is harming me personally, which was absurd because these are journalists and they're some of the most comfortable people in some of the most comfortable journalists in the world compared to people who are now actually on the front lines of this war covering it. So that there's that element. There's also, I think, they're very dangerous one with this war, and we're seeing, which is interesting, how a kind of liberal nationalist jingoism is back. Remember, for the past 4 or 5 years, nationalism was out, right? It was Brexit. It was the rise of these populist nationalist movements across the developed world. But now, in opposition to President Putin, a kind of liberal jingoism even is back in back in flavor. And how do you sustain that narrative is by really oversimplifying, I would argue, of turning Vladimir Putin into just this flat cartoon, right? These Star Wars style, Marvel movie style narratives, and not that, I mean, Vladimir Putin is a former KGB operative, a hard-nosed man, and obviously is not someone to be taken lightly, and certainly not someone to be given a free pass morally, because he's definitely done some really awful things. But to frame him really simplistically is dangerous, because if he's Voldemort, or if he's, you know, the Sauron, or if he's Hitler, then you can't negotiate with him, right? You can only utterly oppose someone like that when you flatten him into an absolute villain, and that, you know, that might not be something we want to do, right? And that then you aren't willing, for example, to give him an off ramp. I've heard people say this so often, that he can't have an off ramp for this. Well, if you don't give him an off ramp, and he's in charge of the world's largest nuclear arsenal, what are you going to do? You're just going to kind of frustrate him to the point, right, where he has really, really dangerous. And there's so the narratives that the media create, we joke, the sort of cliches of Singapore at a crossroads and devastated, used over and over. Those cliche narratives can become dangerous when they obscure decision makers' views of what the risks, for example, of escalating might be.
Is it? I've got to be very careful with the language I use. I was going to use the metaphor of, you know, a toddler tantrum stamping of feet, but there is a bit of that here in some of that liberal pacifism, and maybe that we're at the foothills of this really sharp learning curve for a lot of these newfound jingoists, which is actually, it doesn't matter how much you denounce somebody as a panto villain, it doesn't matter how many times you say they've contravened war crimes laws, doesn't matter how many red lines you set up, you know, if you use chemical weapons, we're going to be really, really angry. If you use nuclear weapons, whoa. But actually, when they wake up and realize that it doesn't matter what you say, he's still in power, the body count is still mounting, and there's nothing you've said, and there is nothing you can do that changes that, then that is a moment of clarity. That is an epiphany for that kind of mindset.
Yes, and the realization, by the way, related that contrary to the narrative, it's painful to admit, contrary to the narrative that the whole world is united against Putin, no. China is sticking by him in a much more so than many people have predicted. India refuses to condemn, and then much of the developing world the same, because they're beginning to see themselves as not part of this Western bloc for various reasons, and so that's another painful realization. You know, we say the whole world is watching. Maybe not.
No, it's funny. The whole world thing. I mean, setting aside, you know, the Economist readers, maybe like Homer Simpson, who do have a sort of world view, I think, that's well informed. It seems to me sometimes that we live in a world where, you know, just because people go for weekend breaks to Prague, that they're worldly, and I don't think we are. I think we're growing less worldly in the West. I think there's actually this kind of new kind of. It sounds like an oxymoron, but sort of intellectual parochialism. I think there's an incuriosity, and it's worse than incuriosity, because people think they know. People think they know how the world works. They think they've got a handle on the work. They know less than they think they know. Yes,
I mean, since we're talking across the Atlantic between Brits and Americans, both have this view because they think that because our language is mutually intelligible to each other, Brits and Americans, obviously it's the same language. We think, for American journalists think British politics are really simple and they know it just as well as they do. Of course it isn't. There's all these historical complexities. And I would say the vice versa as well. A lot of Brits, British journalists think they know America, when in fact it's this continental country with all these subregions and accents and et cetera, and it's not so simple. So Now apply that to countries that are truly alien to us, or more alien to us, and yet our tendency to try to pretend like we know them, and you're set up for a lot of misunderstanding and I think heartache.
I won't pretend that I've got any handle on American politics. Obviously, I said to the kids in the run up to the last presidential election, I said, look, and they were just spouting the usual sort of, Trump's a warmongering, whatever, idiot. And I said, look, it was his final stump speech. Let's watch this. And not for the first time, I was restraining the belly laughs. He makes me laugh. I wouldn't want him running my country necessarily, though I think he's got many great aptitudes, and I think a lot of what he says about a lot of things is apt. On balance, he's not my kind of conservative, if he's a conservative at all. But look, it's not my country. But I said to the kids, open your mind, and at the very least, just see a politician who can make you titter a little bit. And that's what I've missed in recent years. I've just missed a politician who could make me giggle a bit. I mean, that's terribly shallow of me. I know.
I hated the fact that Angela Merkel's name was pronounced Angela. He thought it should be Angela. Therefore, if you watch his speeches, whenever he mentions Angela Merkel, he sort of goes, well, I was talking to Angela, as though it's not her name, it's offensive to him. Which is funny. He was really funny. I hate to say.
Well, there was the scene I made a couple of my kids watch. There's a bit where he's meeting with a couple of they were the kind of trackers, army trackers, whisperers, scouts, and they were Native Americans. And he's presenting with some military award. These old guys, and he says, "But I know a Native American. She goes by the name of, maybe you've heard of her, Pocahontas." And he's talking about Elizabeth Warren. I defy anybody to watch that and not, Anyway, look, a more serious question: Will he win again?
Oh, I don't know. I've done so many sort of prognostications of this kind, and then I predicted Brexit wrong. I predicted the 2016 election wrong. So I don't know. What I will say is that. Let me put it this way. This is my surprise, but I'm very much associated with the American right. But right now, I'm actually very grateful for Biden, as opposed to some of the sort of genuinely scary Republican Party hawks being in power, because who are just sort of like, well, let's escalate, let's blah 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 blah. And Biden's been around the block for foreign policy. He talk about enfeebled. He's incredibly enfeebled, and. I think there's serious questions about his mental acuity. Nevertheless, he's like this sort of old hand, and it's very reassuring compared to who could be power in the midst of this.
Can I? Sorry to interrupt. Can I just make a theological point as well about he's one of us, and I just want, and I say to people when I'm talking about Catholicism that I genuinely do in my heart see all men as my brothers, and that has to be part of it with Biden, doesn't it? That he's not going to look at a Russian and think you're Untermensch, that you're a subhuman who deserves, bombing from 30,000 feet or whatever, unless I really have to. I'm not saying that everybody who isn't, God botherer is somehow inhuman or inhumane, but it's a slice of his personality, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I would say there are other issues in which the church is very clear where politicians should come down, like abortion, which he obviously runs against that. But there is this Irish Catholic sensibility that is undeniably a part of him, and it makes him Biden at his most. And again, I've been so ferociously critical of him at times, but brings up those best moments of him where he's mocked for it sometimes, but he reaches out and hugs someone who is in pain and so forth. It does seem genuine, and I think there is this undercurrent of Irish Catholic sensibility behind it.
Sohrab, I think we just got a cue there from your son who's coughing in the background. That's probably a good place to end this. And who would have thought we'd end up by lauding Sleepy Joe Biden? But there you go. That's the nature of these lengthy conversations. We can get into it. Sohrab, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.